There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. Well, you can see maybe that the bookshelf it's not completely empty. I removed the books from the top 2 shelves so I could move it out from the wall for the stupid cockroach treatment, which was 10 days ago or something, and they've inspected it a week later and there's no cockroaches. There were never any cockroaches in my apartment, but apparently they were somewhere in the building. So I had left it out until the inspection, and now I can't get this stupid bookshelf back snugly against the wall. I can't jiggle it once it gets closer. I needed somebody that has a handyman's brain and brawn to get it all the rest of the way in. So I'm not going to fill it until it's back in there, so it doesn't look quite as stupid as it did last week. All my students in Tokyo, they're saying, "You got a new bookshelf? Why is it empty? What's wrong with you?" But anyway, it's the practical things that defeat Sean the Book Maniac. Anyway, here I am. We've had a winter storm for the last 3 or 4 days, so everything outside is blanketed with snow, and I've stayed indoors. I haven't left the building, actually, in 3 or 4 days. Got some good lot of reading done, and had a wonderful chat with this week's mystery guest. Let's check that out. And today's mystery guest is Anthony Garrett, a writer and editor and all kinds of other literary hats he could probably wear. Anthony Garrett joining us from Salt Lake City. Hello, Anthony.
Hi, Sean. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
It's so great to meet you. Anthony is very active on bookish social media. I would say maybe especially on Twitter, but at least that's where I see him. How many tweets per hour do you manage to put out?
I try to not be on every hour. Sometimes I would say that I don't meet my own goals to not be on all day long, but sometimes I tweet in the morning, but usually I just have a couple hours in the afternoon where I spend more time on there than other times.
Well, good content. And one of the things Anthony's been tweeting about a lot, or that I've been become aware of through his tweets, is he has, what would you say, co-founded a literary journal called Atmospheric Quarterly. Tell us about it, please, Anthony.
Yeah, absolutely. I did co-found a magazine with my co-editor, Jolie Fitch, Atmospheric Quarterly, and you can find it at atmospheric.quarterly.com. You can also find it at Atmospheric Lit, just all one word, on Twitter, or Atmospheric Literary on Instagram. But we are a quarterly magazine. We publish on the equinoxes and solstices. So our next issue, our second issue ever, will be on June 20th. We are really attracted to writing that is really interested in playing with form, and then also often has a weathery bent to it. That's not a requirement that it's about the clouds, but a lot of our social media presence is photographs of clouds and things like that.
Can you just highlight 1 or 2 or 3 representative pieces that are in the current issue? Is it 1.1?
We had a great first issue that was sort of a combination of us soliciting writers who we knew or that we respected a lot, and writers who submitted us work. We were frankly overjoyed with the quality of the work. Not that we were expecting to or hoping to publish anything that was of a lesser quality, but what we got is really something quite astounding. If people wanted to get a feel for the magazine, both in form, style, and in the content, the literary critic and podcaster and social media presence, Rebecca Hussey, wrote a review of the book Tone by Sofia Samatar and Kate Zambrino. It's kind of a hybrid review in that she talks a little bit about her own life and the things that she's doing and the different online and elsewhere literary conversations that she's having. And that sort of hybrid content, but then also the very specifics of that book Tone, I think it is really representative of the magazine in an interesting way.
And now I'm just going to butt in here to say that
Mhm.
that resonates so well with one of my favorite sentences in your introduction to this issue, where
Mm.
you write, "The review is a genre that never accepts the writer's solitary genius."
Yeah, that was a lot of what we wanted to accomplish, even in having the magazine, is so often when you're reading a book, or if you're a writer, when you're writing a book, it can feel and it also is a very lonely activity. But at the same time, writing is an attempt at communication. Reading is an attempt to to be communicated to and to experience another person's mind. And then there are all of these wonderful projects, including your YouTube channel, Sean, of the way in which it really is about finding and people and having conversations. And was a really big goal of the magazine. Absolutely. Maybe if I were to highlight another piece, and I feel bad just not naming everyone all at once, but Isabella Streffen, a lot of people may or may not know her, but she's an artist and a writer in England, and she wrote this piece called the Cyanometer. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Cyanometer for my heart. A cyanometer, for those that don't know, is just something that you use to measure the color blue.
Wow.
And she writes it in a long list of, I think, different measurements of the color of blue. It ends up being 52 of them. But she is just, as an artist, she has a real eye for color, but she also has a real mind and heart for longing and for desire and for a lot of those things that can sometimes be captured so well in writing. And that was a piece I really, really liked.
Was that prose or poetry?
That's a good question. That's
Oh,
part of the reason why I highlight it is often we do want to publish that work that maybe strides that line a little bit. Multiple pieces were prose poems because of the way that she lists. It's basically a list, and most of that list then is single lines, and so it does read quite a bit like poetry. But then you could also call it prose in places.
and then I know that you have one I'd like to hear you say a little bit about, another sentence from your introduction. "Multiple pieces in this issue confront and play with the definition of literature." And you've kind of already said that. But then you go on to talk a little bit about video poetry by someone named Ray Hendricks. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Ray is a tremendous poet that I highly encourage people to search out her work. She has a collection, I believe, coming out in the fall, but she sent us a recording. It looks like the recording of a phone where someone is having a text conversation or attempting to have a text conversation with somebody who lives on the other side of the country. And in the video, you see over and over the text sort of be written out and then erased, written out and then erased. And it does very much have the effect of in a poem where in some ways, you're reading a line and then you would read the next line and then the next line. But it's also because of the way that she portrayed it, it's just captures the difficulty and the anxiety that you might sometimes feel when trying to communicate across both physical and metaphorical distance. And I felt very tenderly towards the speaker, so to speak, of this poem, because there's so many different times that we can feel that kind of anxiety where it can be very difficult to get our thoughts across, or it can be very difficult to know whether we should even say anything. And there's a little bit of humor to it also because it's about, well, the introduction that they're trying to make to this conversation with someone that it seems like they haven't seen for in a while is talking about the weather, and both because of the content of our journal but also of our magazine, but also because that's just the most banal, the easiest thing, the thing that we all can talk about is the weather. But to have something as mundane as that have the significance that Ray imbues it with. It's really quite something.
Well, I haven't. I guess the verb would be watched that yet on in that issue in your current issue. But if I love it half as much as I loved hearing you talk about it, I can't wait. So it's wonderful. I'd like to
Thanks.
actually now kind of segue to you appeared as I recently did, but you even more recently on the Mooks and the Gripes book podcast, talking about poetry. And that's a great, I'll link to that in the show notes. All of the stuff that we're talking about, of course, will be linked in the show notes, including this episode of the Mooks and the Gripes where we talked about poetry. And I enjoyed it very much. I haven't finished listening to it. And here's my thing, and I'm going to put you on the spot, not really put you on the spot, but I can't really get into poetry. The only way that I really, and that's why I'm looking at, especially forward to watching this video poetry is
Hmm.
for me it's an oral thing. If the poet or somebody reads it
Hmm.
to me, I get so much more out of it. But I just can't. I don't read poetry almost not at all. What should I do, Anthony?
I don't have an easy answer to it, but that was part of the question that we addressed in that episode with Trevor and Paul. I don't have an easy answer. I sometimes have the same experience. I guess I would ask a person in general, and maybe you in particular, Sean, if there are poems or collections that you have had positive experiences with, and barring that, maybe a few novels or something that have been particularly good experiences recently, and then see if we could match some poems to or some new collections to the old collections that you've enjoyed, or maybe even to
Oh,
the novels that you've enjoyed.
well, that sounds really interesting, fun, and if you actually have the time to make another video later about that, that would be awesome. But we can talk about that offline. That's
But
great.
but in addition to that, especially hearing that sometimes you have a better experience with when you hear people read it aloud. I sometimes, if I can find the time and place to do that, and especially if I am finding that I'm having a difficult entry point into some poetry, I will sit there and not like it's a performance, but sit there and quietly read a poem aloud to myself and sort of sit with it the way that I do when I'm taking my time with a really dense book of prose, where there are some books that I tend to just read through quickly, and some where I end up underlining almost every word. And those really dense types of novels tend to be the ones I enjoy the most. And so I'll do the same with poems. And I do find myself with novels sometimes not understanding what's going on, and needing to just allow the experience to wash over me. And I would just encourage people. I think sometimes the way that we're taught poetry, we're taught as if there's this secret skeleton key that you don't have that would give you access to it. And I don't know that that's true. There may be things that we're missing. Surely there are things that an author sometimes intends that we miss, but also just let it wash over you. It is just we're having an embodied experience, and you know that there are sounds and rhythms that we can enjoy. There are images or words that we can enjoy, even if we don't immediately have access to all the other parts.
I love that phrase to let it wash over you. You
Trevor
and Paul
and
and
Paul.
Trevor were talking about letting it wash over you, and that phrase has been kind of being bandied about it on Booker social media for
Mhm,
years, and I love it. Yeah, no, it's
mhm.
that's exactly right. And you're also a writer, so tell us about your writing, Anthony.
Yeah, that is maybe out of all of these different hats that we were referring to, the one that is most important to me, though I love being a reader, and I love being an editor, the way that it brings me in contact with so many tremendous writers just feels like an amazing privilege. But writer is the thing that I have thought of myself as the longest in regards to these things. And there's so many different ways that I could talk about that story. But um, when I was 17, I just had a tremendous high school English teacher. And the very first book that we read in her class was Crime and Punishment. And the way that she talked about Dostoevsky's work and opened it up, I didn't know before that literature could accomplish so many different things, that it could have so many different things that it was doing, that it could be operating on multiple different levels at the same time. And I was just immediately enraptured and just I had been a reader a little bit, but I just totally fell in love with books at that point. And as that year went on, but I think within the first couple of weeks of that class, I said, this is what I'm going to do. And I I then really struggled to for a very, very long time, even though through those struggles, I was eventually able to get a master's in writing. After I graduated, I struggled to write a novel for years and years and years. And I struggled so much that it was affecting my mental health in a serious way. And addressed that and sought out help and most importantly received an ADHD diagnosis, which made all of the sense in the world to me that, oh, there's a reason why I can't stay on one task at a time and that my mind wants to flit about and do something else so quickly. That realization, and yes, the medication that can come with that, but most of all, a sort of acceptance of the way that my brain works and the type of person that I am was so, so helpful. And so I had been working on one project for several years, just a few sentences at a time, very scattershot vignettes that didn't really add up to anything. But then over the last year and a half, 2 years, that initial idea has formulated to the point that I am very close to being done with the first draft of this novel, which is tentatively titled Neither Themselves Nor Each Other. It's about three characters, a man, a woman, and a woman. The first woman is the man's first wife who passes away before the main narrative of the book. And then another woman who becomes a mother much earlier in life than she planned to. And that man and that woman, they're coming together and supporting each other and eventually falling in love. But they're contradicted feelings about that, given the way that life for both of them turned out very differently than they anticipated. And it deals with also the complicated ways in which telling another person's story is that something that we should be doing? Like, what feelings do we bring to that?
That sounds amazing. So I'd like to pre-book you for when the novel comes out to chat more about it. That's awesome.
I'd love to come back.
And
It's been quite something to finally, after so much struggle for so many years, to feel it and see it come together.
there's one more thing that's on the website Tin House, and I don't know much about what Tin House is, but there's a profile of you there that says his writing embraces a neurodivergent poetics that eschews traditional forms. I hope I pronounced all those big words correctly. Could you riff on that for just a minute or two before we talk about what you've been reading recently?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. Tin House, in addition to being a publisher, also runs a very important workshop, one of the main 3 or 4 major workshops through the year for young writers or beginning career writers. And as I was just learning all of these things about myself, I applied by submitting several pages of this novel to the workshop, and they were kind enough not only to accept me out of, I think 100 or so people attended, but I was one of the few people that was also given a scholarship and named one of the scholars to the session that I attended, which was just a tremendous privilege and honor. And both the writers, as far as my peers there, and the faculty, just an overwhelming experience to have those interactions and build those relationships. As far as answering that question about neurodivergent poetics, I talked a little bit about the way that my brain works. I can either go on for a long time, or I can have my attention distracted very quickly, or I can really drill down into like a detail that to most people wouldn't seem very important. And for me, that also ends up being the characteristics of a lot of my favorite writing. A lot of my favorite novels are people who either, like a Jon Fosse or maybe like a Lucy Ellman, just have sentences that go on for the whole book practically. Or I also just like very fragmented and fragmentary works where you're jumping around in time and place, you're jumping between points of view, and then all of the things in between. But for me, the books that are often most interesting are the ones that aren't just a traditional realist novel told in a really straightforward chronological way. And it's been interesting as I've learned more about the way that my brain works to see that sort of mirrored in the type of literature that interests me most.
Well, I bet some of those kinds of books are going to be coming up soon because I'm going to ask you what you've been reading recently.
Great. So let me start, and I'll just hint that there will be more info about this in the near future, but I don't want to give it away yet. But I started reading, and I know the
Oh,
camera takes a second to adjust, but I've started reading the 1,300-page Miss MacIntosh, my darling, um,
yes.
that
What
Dalkey
did you
recently
just call
reissued.
me? Sorry, I couldn't resist.
But am having just a tremendous experience with the book on a word by word, sentence by sentence level, page by page, and then just seeing the details and the repetitions accumulate over pages. It's just a powerful work that is like some works I've other, I think other large books like Don Quixote or Herman Melville's Moby Dick are not only good comparisons, but she makes direct allusion to, but is also very unlike other books because it's her point of view, both I think the narrator, Vera Cartwheel, and Marguerite Young have this perspective that the United States doesn't become more boring and more plain and easier to understand as you approach it both geographically and spiritually in the center, but that it in fact gets more complex and that there's more awe and more mystery the closer you get to those places that are in the middle of the country. And it's a very simple narrative in some ways. Vera Cartwheel is riding a bus. She's trying to find her nanny, Miss MacIntosh, who took care of her when she was a young person. And she's on the bus. I haven't finished the novel yet, but as far as I understand, she's on that bus for a lot of the book. But then the book is very much about the, for her, the hazy line between reality and illusion, reality and hallucination, reality and the imagination, and the way that those things sort of interweave is is just a pleasure to read. And yeah, I alluded to this, but I am working with another writer that we are probably going to have a project that celebrates the novel appearing online in the not too distant future.
If I'm understanding it correctly, it was just recently brought back into print after being really difficult to find for a large number of years by Dalkey Archive, right?
That's
That's the
correct.
one. And how many? 1,300 pages. Oh my God.
Yeah. There's a famous, or at least for those that know the book or the author, there's a famous photo of Marguerite Young hugging the manuscript. I don't even I don't remember how many millions of words it is and how many in that form, how many pages it was, but she just has this tower-like stack of papers on her lap, and she's sort of hunched over it, hugging it. I, before she started writing it, she thought it says in the really good introduction to the book, it says that she planned to write it for about 2 years. And it wasn't out of any failure. She didn't experience writer's block, but it just became this much bigger thing that she wrote over 18 years.
And I've been Googling while you've been telling me this to see that you tweeted I will hug Miss MacIntosh, my darling, like, let's see, like Marguerite Young does its manuscript here when I have it in my hands. And so that photo,
I
I'm going to
absolutely
put,
did that. Let me mention a book that I am rereading by an author that I really appreciate that came out last year. This is the ARC. This is the
ah,
advanced review copy, but Landscapes by Christine Lai. Christine is a tremendous author, and this is just a pleasure of a book to read, especially if you're the type of person who enjoys books. Just a brief description. It's a post-apocalyptic setting, but it doesn't feel like most post-apocalyptic novels. The main character is a woman who is on this grand estate that is now sort of falling into disrepair given the circumstances that the novel takes place in. And she is archiving the literature and the artwork that is present in this grand estate. And the novel is sort of told largely, though there are some other parts in her diary that she's keeping while she's doing this work. And so there's a real concern in the book for the environment and a real appreciation for the beauties of nature. And then there's also a real appreciation for the beauties of literature and of art. And I would say that in particular, the novel explores the paintings of J.M.W. Turner, but because of the work that she's doing, it's a very sort of intertextual book where, whether explicitly or implicitly, she is alluding to other books all of the time. And there's actually references that she places in the back that if people want to further explore the books that she's thinking about and talking about, she wanted to make sure that those were made very clear in the back of the book.
just by following my nose through recent reading over the past few years, I've become more and more interested in fiction literature that's about art. The pretentious name is ekphrasis, writing about art in
Mm-hmm.
literature, and I've just gotten really, really into it. So that one sounds really intriguing, and she's kind of Canadian.
She is. She lives in Vancouver, I believe. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So, well, Anthony, I am stimulated up to my earlobes. This was a wonderful chat. I hope you'll come back.
Absolute pleasure that you would have me on and to let me talk about some of the books I've been enjoying, especially recently.
I was very impressed with Anthony Garrett, and I hope you were too. And please go check out Atmospheric Quarterly. I, in particular, have checked out the video poem, which was wonderful. All right, I have one announcement about Patreon, and that is that I've added a new benefit. I am now going to be doing book giveaways on Patreon, and it doesn't matter at which paid tier you subscribe to my Patreon, that you can be entered to win. And so I'm going to show you the book that's up for grabs at the moment. And that is the book that I read earlier this year and was on Anna's Books on the Go podcast, home reading service by Fabio Morabito, translated from the Spanish by Curtis Bauer. Wonderful, wacky novel, all about reading and all the crazy things that can get bound up in that exercise, in particular reading aloud. I won't say more about it here. I'll put a link in the show notes to that podcast chat. How the giveaway benefit works on my Patreon. I'm going to still do book giveaways on my main channel, especially on my anniversaries, but this is a benefit on Patreon to lure more of you on, if I can. As a patron, you're not automatically entered for each giveaway, but you just have to enter your name. So you just have to leave a comment on the Patreon page. Yes, please enter my name, because I'm going to do a random draw in a couple of weeks. I think it's May 5th or something. I'm going to do a random draw, and I'm not going to send a book in the mail to you if you aren't interested in the book. So you have to actually enter the draw by leaving a comment, and then it's all tickety-boo. And I'm going to have fun picking out brand new books, not used books, not my bales, not hand-me-downs, but brand new books as giveaways on a quarterly basis. There'll probably be 2 more after this because I was late getting started, but that is now part of the package for anybody who joins at any level. enough of my Patreon promotion for this particular Friday Reads. And let me tell you what I've been up to on YouTube this week. I've put up 3 videos since last week's Friday Reads. A long-form chat. This is the inaugural episode, I guess I'm calling them episodes, of a new series. Sharon Butala and Sean the Bookmaniac talk books. Sharon Butala, I've interviewed her about her own writing several times in the past year or so. And she was a mystery guest 2 or 3 times last year. And she has so much interesting stuff to say about what she's reading. And I have decided actually not to have repeat guests for the mystery guests. It's not all that mysterious when somebody shows up a second time. So this is a new series, and these are long-form chats. This one is 45 minutes long of Sharon Butala holding forth on what she has been reading. Do check that out. And I have got a new episode of Zooming In up. This is with the wonderful Hannah of Hannah's Books. She and I discussed an article on women writers who destroy their own work. That was quite an interesting chat, I thought. And, of course, a wee book haul. All right, I have finished 3 books. So that is pretty amazing. The first one I'm going to tell you about is David Carpenter's first novel, Jewels. This was a reread for me. It was published in 1985, the same year as his collection of novellas, which, like this, I read to Mary Jean on Facebook Messenger. I hadn't remembered really anything about this when I read it, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, and this is a crazy novel. First of all, it's a physically beautiful book. I can't wait to ask David about the design of the book. And that's what it looked like back in the day, back when I first knew him. So I'm going to be doing a long-form interview with him about this in due course. I am interviewing David much more frequently than the videos are going up because I don't want to just flood my channel with David Carpenter videos every 2 weeks or whatever, but this will come out much later. It didn't quite work for me. The plot was really zany, but the writing was so damn good, and the descriptions of the characters and the foibles and the settings, the nature writing, all of it was just, he's just been a really, on the level of sentences and prose, he's just been a really gifted writer from day one. It was a bit too crazy of a plot for me. But that's fine. It probably wouldn't be too crazy for many of you. Stay tuned for our chat. The highlight of this week's reading, and this month, perhaps one of the very brightest highlights of my reading year. The Hearing Test, a debut work of autofiction by Eliza Callahan. Callahan is a writer from New York City and also an artist and musician, which is not surprising because of how much music and art play a part in this incredible account. She's on her way to a wedding in Vienna when something weird happens to her hearing. Not just weird, but very disturbing. So she can't go to the wedding. And she's told she's been struck by sudden deafness. And it's not that she goes deaf overnight, but that certain sounds she can't hear and temporarily, and then they'll come back and then they'll go away again. And other sounds are distorted, and she's hearing almost like a tinnitus type sound all the time, and it just fluctuates throughout this book, which is the chronicle of her first year dealing with it. And if that sounds like it's going to be too serious or something, it's not at all. I mean, it's definitely a serious condition. She writes about it with intellectual curiosity and an incredible amount of humor, and with this, I don't know how to describe the prose style. I think I'm going to reread it again. I don't like the American edition covered. It's too boring for me. The only part that's the library is this. So this is kind of what the cover looks like without the ugly library stickers. And I just, I don't like it. So I'm going to order the UK softcover edition, and that's what this cover looks like, which I much prefer. And I'm probably going to reread it. She just follows her nose, and her nose is so interesting. The way her curiosity goes from one memory, and that memory might be of an experience she's had, a story someone told her, a scene in a movie, a particular work of art, And it just moves that way, in a way that I'm not much of a poetry reader, as you just heard me talk about, but in a way that kind of operates on the level of poetry, but it's narrative and prose. And I don't mean the writing is poetic. I don't know what I can't quite articulate it, but there's just something about the moving from one image or memory to another and following the way her mind works, that's just, it was incredibly compelling. I know that it's not a book for everyone, but I thought it was absolutely stunning. And it's not even a Sean book. There was things that made me really feel for her, but it's not. My investment in it was just the incredibly humorous, insightful, curious, intellectually stimulating way that she got through that first year with sudden hearing loss. It was a one-of-a-kind read for me. I recommend it very highly. I would say if you can preview it to see how you're going to get on with that style of writing, I would like each and every one of you to try it. And finally, the third book I finished, I did as an audio text combo, but it was mostly listening on audio because the audio narration was so damn good, almost to a fault. But this may be my first rant on my channel in a good long while, so fasten your seatbelts, people. Strange Flowers by the Irish writer Donal Ryan, and the audio narration, I don't know if there's more than one version out there. I'm actually going to double check to make sure. The audio narrator is Donna Nicolaisen. I'll print her name here. It'll be in the show notes. I would say anything you can find that this audio narrator does, you should give it a try. It was a peak audiobook experience. I see she's a theater actor. She's an Irish stage and screen actor and voice artist. She is amazing because there are a bunch of characters in this book, which is set in Ireland, who come from other cultural groups, and how she does all those voices to my ears perfectly. It just added so much to the experience of consuming the novel, reading the novel, but I think it might also be to a fault because the novel itself was almost a complete and utter failure. I gave it 2 stars, and that's because the second half was god-awful, just terrible. I tried another Donal Ryan novel about 5 or 6 years ago that was up for a Booker, From a Low and Quiet Sea, and I didn't like it. I gave it 3 stars. And I was tougher on this one because it's a later novel, and it's my second go-around, and he hasn't improved a damn bit. I would say Donal Ryan has a big heart, but he does not have the ability in any of the novels that I've read, and I've now read 2, to create fully fledged characters without falling into gross sentimentality. And he keeps writing. He's kind of like John Boyne in that he keeps writing about stuff he has no business writing about. And I'm not saying, because I know there's a lot of contention about this issue, anybody can write whatever they want, but they have to be good at it. And he's terrible at writing characters or stories that aren't about rural Irish folk. From a Low and Quiet Sea was just awful. And this one also, the characters who were not rural Irish country folk, there were so many holes in their characters, they were so uninteresting, they were so limply drawn. And he just has way too many kind of plot twists that just feel really forced. There is a sexuality thing, and there was just way too many lovable characters. The mom and dad of the woman who disappears at the beginning of the novel, they are really sweet, and they have layers, but everybody else was way too nice. And then there was one villain who we find out how villainous that one guy was at the end of the novel, and that was just it was like Victorian melodrama. I will never read Donal Ryan again. So enough of my rant. Well, I was already starting to disassemble everything and change that in my new blouse. And I realized there's a couple of important things that I forgot to say about the Donal Ryan book, so this is just a little insert. What I meant when I said the audiobook was almost too good is that I didn't notice a lot of the things because it was so powerfully narrated by the audio narrator. So the characters who come from a different background, who live in Ireland, who are in this novel, their accents were done perfectly. But I don't think I was able to get beyond that. I was so impressed with that I don't think I fully took stock of how well they were portrayed. I would probably need to reread the book in order to make a judgment, but I know other reviews take issue with that. And I have to say, and so this is maybe not so much a criticism, it's just an observation, that he writes these long run-on sentences, like 700 clauses with and I almost didn't even hear it, just listening, because it sounded like speech. It sounded like spoken English, and it did have a melody to it, but I remember that bothered me on the page when I read the other novel. Those are my additional thoughts. And lots of people out there, some of whom I know occasionally watch me, or who I'm friends with in the bookish world, really like his stuff. I think he's subpar. And boy, it feels good to rant again. Anyhow, enough about that. I forgot last week to check in on the Elizabeth Jane Howard novel, Something in Disguise, that I started the week before. And it's going really well. It is from 1969. This one is a lot funnier. I'm noticing now a progression. Elizabeth Jane Howard's early novels were much darker, and it's not that the stories are becoming less dark, they're not. So this one is not shaping up to be it's not turning out to be a social comedy. And I like reading social comedies, but Elizabeth Jane Howard is a master of really densely psychological, really compelling stories with really bad characters that are so nuanced that you don't even really hate them. Donal Ryan could learn a thing or two from her. But there's more and more humor in the plots. I noticed it in the last one I read, After Julius, and even more so here. And I know people have described her Cazalet Chronicles, which is a series of novels with the same characters, and it's described as being fairly light compared to what my experience of her earlier stuff is. But I wouldn't describe this as light, but it's also really funny. The mother figure, she's married her second husband, and he is an old poop. She has 2 grown children from her first marriage. They don't like the stepfather. He's not evil, he's just an old poop. He, the old poop, he has a daughter, and the opening chapter is her wedding, and she is so glad to get out of the house because her father is an old poop. She loves him, but he's an old poop, and he's pretty domineering in terms of, he forces his second wife to use her inheritance to buy them a big house that it takes so much work to run, and he doesn't lift a finger. Like, it's that kind of a marriage. And so Alice, his daughter, is so glad to fly the coop, but her husband is a young poop. Oh, he's terrible. So there's all these characters, but they're not evil. Do I want them to be darker? No, because they're still really compelling, and the story is a little bit madcap, and it's making me laugh, and that's all I'll say for now. But another novel, Elizabeth Jane Howard is hitting out of the park thus far. All right, Editing Sean here. I have to just redo this silly little introduction to the books I'm going to start in the coming week. The book that I'm now going to be reading to Mary Jean, in fact, I started last night, is a reread of Marzahn, amour by Katja Oskamp, translated from the German by Joe Heinrich, who was my mystery guest a few months back. And I loved the first chapter even more than when I read it the first time. And finally, my audiobook. This will be an audio-text combo. Michael Crummey's latest, The Adversary. So I have the audiobook, and I have the book, and I'm going to start. I can't wait. I hear it's just wonderful. And Michael Crummey is one of Canada's best male writers. All right, that's what I got this week. Quite a lot of excitement. Thanks for watching.